Hi, my name is Dale Maley. I'd like to tell you about a very interesting project I recently completed. And it involves building a display case from just plain old common pine. Now, some background on this project. I have a need to build anywhere from 1 to 3 display cases for a special historical project. And long term, for the room I have, I could fit in 2 cases that are 5 feet long by 2 foot deep, and 1 case that's 4 foot long. But I decided to just build one of the 5-footers first to kind of figure out what I was doing. Now, a few months ago, I had the opportunity to see some display cases that were actually built out of common 1x4 pine. And I went to Jerry's Hat Museum, which is in Forest, Illinois. It's an old church. And he's collected over 30,000 ball caps and I think over 20,000 pens. Anyway, as part of that museum, he built some of his own display cabinets. And I was kind of impressed because they were from common 1x4 pine. So he let me photograph his display cases, and I think they're nice looking, and I like the fact they're just use standard pine. So I'm going to modify his design and use it for my project. Now, I have built several much smaller display cases like the one shown in the photograph here. You can see the coffee cup for scale. On that particular one I used red oak. And then I didn't use glass, I used clear acrylic plastic from my local Ace hardware store in Fairbury, Illinois. And that acrylic comes, it's actually clear acrylic like glass, comes in 3 thicknesses. 0.100 inches, or 100 thousandths, 0.118, or 0.220. Now I think on my past smaller projects I used the middle one, which is 0.118. So I decided for the grooves in the wood that would hold the acrylic, I would make those an 1/8 inch deep and 3/4 inch wide. And I'm going to go with that 0.118 inch thick acrylic. Then I'll use 1.5 inch wide by 3/8 thick molding to hold the acrylic in place using some wood screws. And what that does, it lets me finish the wood first before I install any of the acrylic, because I don't want to get any of my finishing materials onto that acrylic. Now here's a drawing showing how I'm going to retain the clear acrylic. So the yellow board, that's one of the main frame pieces. I will route a groove in there, an 1/8 inch deep and 3/4 inch wide. Then you can see the 0.118 inch thick clear acrylic, and then to retain it, there's my 1.5 inch wide by 3/8 thick molding. That will cover the acrylic by the 3/4 inches, leaving 3/4 inches on the outside to screw it on. Now what I don't know is if the 0.118 will be thick enough for the top when people press down on it. We'll kind of have to try it out and see. Worst case, I could go to the thicker material if I had to. I'd have to cut the grooves a little deeper, but I could do that. Now the router bit that I used to make the 1/8 inch deep groove by 3/4 wide, it's actually a 1 inch diameter bit, and that one's pretty heavy duty. It has a 1/2 inch shank instead of a 1/4 for the router. And I was able to cut that 1/8 inch deep groove 3/4 wide just using one pass on the router table. Here's another photograph looking down at that 1 inch diameter router bit installed in the router table, ready to cut the 1/8 inch deep groove 3/4 inch wide. Now in the lower part of the display case, I do have some wood panels that will have to fit into grooves I have to make. And you could just use a 1/4 inch diameter fairly long router bit, but I wanted to use a spiral router bit instead. So the groove's going to be 1/4 inch wide by 3/8 inch deep. Usually I do that in 2 passes. And I can't remember whether to use the downcut or upcut version of the spiral, so I asked Perplexity AI program. It said to use a downcut spiral, which forces chips away from the router or into the bottom of the groove. And you get no tear out where the panel slips in to the groove. If you use an upcut version, it's much faster, but it gives you tear out where your wood panel is going to slide into the groove. And it turns out I do own a used downcut style of spiral router bit. Here's a photo of my used spiral 1/4 inch router bit, and you'll notice on the left hand side it's a little black on that end because it does get hot because you're forcing the chips into the bottom of the groove. So I sure hope it cuts okay when I first looked at it, but after I was able to use it on the whole project and it worked fine. Now I use a free drafting program called SketchUp for all my woodworking projects. So here's the SketchUp drawing of my 5-foot display case, and you'll see there's some wood panels on the sides and bottom as well. Now here's a view looking at the back of the 5-foot long display case. You'll see I'm going to use 2 sliding doors in the back to give access to put items in for display or change items on display. Now on a project like this I try to minimize the number of router table setups because they take time. So I decided, hey, let's do all the 1/8 inch deep by 3/4 inch wide grooves in one pass. Do all those first on the front of the cabinet and the 2 sides, and then set up the spiral bit for the lower sections which have the wood panels, and do those in 2 passes. Now that back piece, I'll do that later, and that's okay to have some more setups for that. So let's just take a minute and review some of my key design and process items for this project. The footprint of the cabinet's going to be 60 inches wide by 24 inches deep. The height's going to be 32 inches. For the clear panels, I'm going to use 0.118 inch thick clear acrylic, and I'll buy that acrylic from my Fairbury Ace hardware store. How am I going to retain the acrylic sheets? I'm going to use 3/8 by 1.5 inch molding to retain the acrylic using 1-inch brass screws to the main frame. And for lumber, I'm just using common 1x4 pine, which actually are 3/4 inch thick and 3.5 inches wide. Some more key items include the acrylic groove that I need. I'll use a 1-inch diameter by 1/2 inch shank router bit on the router table, cutting a 1/8 inch deep groove by 3/4 inch wide. The wood panels, I ended up using 3/16 inch thick Luan plywood. The panel grooves are 1/4 inch wide by 3/8 deep. To make the grooves, I'm going to use a 1/4 inch diameter spiral down cut bit. The main frame joints will be 1.25 inch Craig pocket screws, and the bottom shelf I'll make that from 3/16 inch thick Luan. For the upper shelf inside the cabinet, I'll use 2 Ace steel brackets. I'll mount those to the vertical 1x4s in back. For that upper shelf, I'll use just common pine 1x12. To access inside of the cabinet, I'll use 2 sliding back doors made from 3/16 inch thick Luan plywood. And the sliding door grooves, by the way, the top groove needs to be deeper so you can lift the door up enough that the bottom will go in the bottom groove. So what that means is the top groove needs to be 3/4 inch thick or deep. The bottom groove will be just 3/8 deep. That way you can slide the panel up and then drop it down. Now the last key items for the finish really had 2 options in mind, either amber shellac or brush on a fruitwood stain, oil stain. Don't wipe it off, and then put 1 coat of polyurethane. I eventually decided to go with just the amber shellac. And then the sliding door handles, I made those from 4-inch long, 3/4 inch thick pine. I glued those 1 inch in from the edge of the door panels. Now let's talk about the process I used to make the 3/8 inch thick by 1.5 inch wide moldings to screw on and cover the acrylic sheets. So I took a 1x4 and I ripped it to 1.5 inch wide strips, and then I ripped those down just in half exactly, which gives you about 3/8 thick. Now I have a Diablo thin curve blade on my table saw. It cuts about 3/32 wide into the wood, which bottom line is your strips are just a hair under 3/8 thick, which is fine. The good news for me was I did not have to plane those strips or sand them after I table sawed them. I just used them right off the table saw. So here we are starting to assemble the first side frame of the display cabinet. I tend to use blue masking tape to mark each piece. This is kind of custom built cabinet, and it's easier to remove the tape than it is to erase a whole bunch of pencil marks. I also use the tape to make sure each board is facing the right way against the fence on the router table. Here's a photo where I'm kind of dry assembling up 3 of the sides, the front and the 2 sides, and then I just laid the top on top just for the photograph. Here's a photo with a front view of the display cabinet as I'm starting to assemble up the panels. We're looking pretty good so far. Now, because I'm going to end up transporting this display cabinet in pieces from my Fairbury, Illinois shop 16 miles over to Pontiac and reassemble it, I decided to add some guide blocks in the front corners to aid in the quick reassembly. And those are just made from 1/4 inch thick pine that I glued and nailed on. Here's a more close-up photo showing you the little guide blocks that I put at the top and bottom of each corner to aid in quick and correct reassembly. In this photo you can see where I've installed the 4 mitered pieces that hold the acrylic sheets in place. I also added the horizontal piece which will support the lower shelf in the cabinet. Now let's talk about the 2 sliding doors in back of the display case again. As I said, you need to make the top groove deeper, so when you install the doors you slip them up until they stop in the upper groove. Then you let them by gravity fall down into the lower groove, which means the bottom groove's got to be 1/4 inch wide by 3/8 deep, but that top groove needs to be 1/4 inch wide by 3/4 of an inch deep. Now I decided just to add on another 1x4 on the back to make the 2 grooves that you need, and you will see that in a second. In this view in SketchUp you can see the extra 1x4 piece that I added to get me 2 grooves in the back of the cabinet. Now we need 2 grooves in the back, so the inner door groove is going to be in the main frame of the cabinet, and then the outer door groove will be in a separate trim board which is screwed onto the back of the main frame. To make the 2 back sliding doors I needed to saw them out of a sheet of 3/16 inch thick Luan. And a trick that I've kind of learned over the years, I don't want to have much tear out from my table saw when I saw these. So what you can do is just put blue masking tape on and mark it, and then saw through the tape and then remove the excess tape when you're done. And it reduces the amount of splintering and tear out and gives you a much nicer looking edge. As you can see in this photo, I really got some nice looking edges with no tear out from the table saw. So you need some handles to move those sliding doors in back. So here's my SketchUp drawing showing what I came up with the handles for the back sliding doors. As I mentioned before, it's kind of a tough decision, what do I use for a finish, and I finally decided to keep it simple and just go with the amber shellac. And I did that because it's the least time, and you just have to put 1 coat of shellac on versus 2 coats of stain and polyurethane. And I think it really looks better on the ochre Luan panels also. Here's photos of some of the component pieces drying after I applied 1 coat of shellac. Here's some more component pieces drying after their 1 coat of shellac. So the next question is how to cut the clear acrylic sheets. I need 4 of them. On the smaller projects I just put on blue masking tape and table sawed them okay, but I need quite a bit bigger pieces, so it might be easier just to have Ace Hardware use their machine to cut the 4 pieces. Turns out I could have cut these at home on my table saw because the max fence width is 19 1/4, so I could have done it, but I had Ace cut them instead. Now for the shelf that's going to fit inside of the cabinet. Turns out it's going to be about 56 inches wide. I thought that was too big a span just to have shelf brackets on each end, so I ended up installing 3 of the steel shelf brackets to support that shelf. Since I did not plan on installing the 4 acrylic panels until I was in the house in Pontiac where it goes, I did go ahead and check the fit of all 4 of the clear acrylic sheets to make sure they fit okay before I transported them 16 miles to Pontiac. When I started this project, I had to make a choice which thickness of acrylic to use, and I had 3 choices. And I chose the middle one, 0.118 inches thick. And I was really nervous, is that going to be stiff enough for the top of that display cabinet? So I dry assembled it up in my Fairbury shop, and then I put the retaining boards in to hold them in place, pushed down in the center with my hand, and yes, the acrylic did deflect a little bit, but I think it's going to be acceptable for this display cabinet application. Here's a photograph of all the pieces that are in that display cabinet in my Ford pickup truck, and I've just taken it to Pontiac, and I'm parked at the front steps. I'm going to take it up to the 2nd story and assemble the cabinet in Pontiac. Here's a photo of the finished cabinet, display cabinet in the room in Pontiac. I think it turned out really nice looking, given that it's just made out of plain old common 1x4 pine. So a few closing thoughts on this project. It was a fun project for me, and when you use the Craig pocket screw method, it's easy to make it transportable and reassemblable, and it turned out to be a very nice looking display case just using common pine. So in summary, this short video explains how to make a nice looking display cabinet using plain old common pine. I hope this video helps you on some of your projects. I hope you enjoyed the video, and please subscribe. Thank you.